Hi, class. How is everybody? I just wanted to be just encouraging you guys to keep up with this philosophy class. I know some of it it can be some of the reading is quite complex. So just really appreciate all of your perseverance and your resiliency to finish till the end. But I wanted to encourage many of you as well, just to continue to, with these journals, try to, as much as you can, uh, the journals, as I said in the syllabus, and I said in the first journal, these are not biographies per se. They're not like so. You never want to start a journal like I think this, and this. You actually want to really utilize your book. So you want to begin the journal with a lot of rhetoric, and when I say, excuse me, not rhetoric, but grammar. And grammar, what I mean by grammar, I don't mean by subject, verb, object per se. What I mean by that is grammar is just another word that's used for explaining to me what the gist of the chapter is about. So it's very important that you start the journal like, Solomon and Higgins introduced their concept of God as blah, 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 blah. Okay, so give me some definitions, expand the chapter, use the chapter, utilize it. So really, I mean, none of you should be struggling with 2 pages here. Honestly, many of you should probably be struggling to even fit in within 2 pages. I mean, two pages is simply the minimum amount of work that I actually want to see from you. So the chapters are huge; they're packed and with a lot of information. The other thing too, and the reason why I say that is because I really want you guys to work hard, but not work too hard. What do I mean by that? The nice thing about utilizing your book is that you don't have to come up with this huge summary of the chapter. That could just be exhausting. What I want you to do is that I want you to tell me what the chapter is really about and use Solomon and Higgins' main arguments to basically explain to me that you get what the chapter is talking about. So that's 2 things. Number one, I don't want you to copy and paste, obviously. So I don't want you just to give me lots of definitions. It's not a dictionary. It is a journal. But at the same time, I want you to at least bring a lot out of the chapter, define your terms. It's even sometimes helpful after each paragraph just to give me a little bit of somewhat of a quote or whatnot. And when you do that, you'll notice that your writing is a lot better. And then at the very, very end, don't always forget this, at the very, very end, your second or third or even fourth page, that's when I want you to tell me your own personal thoughts of the chapter. It doesn't have to be long, but just a little bit. And the reason why I have it like that, as I've explained before, is just because that teaches you how to be a philosopher. That teaches you how to think philosophy. Philosophy is not offering your own personal opinions in the very, very beginning. Philosophy, especially when you're expanding on it and you're talking about utilizing it, it's always telling your audience how you respect the books or the readings that you're coming in contact with, and bringing up their own arguments on your own. So it's actually kind of it's philosophy is a lot like listening. So I teach a lot of listening for couples, and I always have say for example, if it's a husband and a wife, I try to have the husband tell the wife what the wife is saying, and from an empathetic way. So your wife, Susie, you feel frustrated that I come home so late at night. Okay, and it's very hard for the guy to do sometimes because he just wants to offer his own opinion in the very, very beginning. And yet that's not real listening. And when he says that to his wife, guess what happens? Susie actually feels more understood. And then Susie tells him what she's feeling. Okay, so the same somewhat of a same approach in the sense that you want to really listen to what Solomon and Higgins are saying. Tell me what they are, how they're constructing their argument, and then very, very end, I want you to tell me what you actually think as well. It's a different approach, but I guarantee that you'll be better off the more you do it. So my grading is getting a little bit more strict now. Now that we're in our third week, it's going to get a lot more strict. And I just wanted to encourage all of you on that end. So the majority of this chapter, I am going to I want to talk about. Excuse me. The majority of this lecture, I want to talk about the 2 kinds of truth. I'm going to talk a little bit about self. I actually felt like that chapter was pretty clear. It's just different views of the self. it was much like the chapter that we had read on, I believe it was chapter 2, the meanings of life. Chapter 7 is, excuse me, yeah, chapter 7 is chapter 6, excuse me. Chapter 6 is somewhat kind of a refreshing chapter. It's a great break because you kind of feel like after the first 5 chapters, your brain is kind of hurting big time, and it should be. And then when he talks about the self, it's a little bit easier to read. It's a little bit more easy to follow. So I'm not gonna lecture too much on that. I mean, just because it's constructed in much like chapter 2 when it just talks about all these different meanings of self per se. So it's more of more more defined, I suppose. But I do feel like it's important that we talk about chapter 5 because it's pretty packed with a lot of meaning. So the first thing that Solomon Higgins tells us about is that there are 2 types of truth out there. There are true statements because they are factually true, and then there are true statements because of reasoning. And so that kind of sets up the whole argument between rationality and epistemology, or rationalism versus epistemological reasoning. So what comes prior, a priori, what is based on a priori evidence. And a priori does not mean before per se, it just more means innate. So what you innately know versus what you experience. And that is kind of the gist of the whole chapter, because then he just kind of goes into dialoguing about how those 2 realities how philosophers have actually held onto rationality or epistemology, not epistemology, but empirical truth versus rational truth or necessary truth, and how they've often kind of struggled to find what is at the end of the day more true, or what we can actually rely on. So let's talk a little bit about empirical truth. So empirical truth is just basically what is based on your own experience, what your senses see, hear, touch, but also what you know. So empirical truth really is focused on not necessarily subjectivism, but it's on you, the subject, and how you construct your own kind of categories of reality. So empiricism, or empirical truth, is going to be, it is true because you've experienced it. And the reason why people end up being empiricists is because as much as there might be an outside world, you really can't define that outside world outside of what you know, outside of your own interpretations of that world. So many empiricists like John Locke or David Hume, they might say that, yes, there's kind of an outside world, but you can't necessarily understand that without dialoguing or bringing some kind of form to that world. So empirical truth is true because of experience on page 144. And this is contingent, which just means it depends on our own experience of it. It's contingent. If it's true, then it's true. If it's false, it is false. So in other words, it's contingent on what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch as true or as not true. Now that is very different from necessary truth, because necessary truth is is opposite from contingent, in the sense that necessary is we can always imagine we can't imagine a world without these truths. So an example of necessarily true would be like 2 + 2 = 4. We cannot see the world or understand the world outside of these necessary truths, regardless of whether or not it's contingent on what we experience or don't experience. So a necessary truth would be, as I said, mathematical tautologies, maybe the law of contradiction, which is something cannot be A and not A in the same relationship. All right, you cannot. It's sunny outside. It cannot be sunny outside and dark outside at the same time. Pitch dark. All right, so that's the law of contradiction. Something cannot be white and black in the same kind of relationship. So necessary truths, what you need to understand is that's the a priori. That is the innate understanding of our own reality. Noam Chomsky has done significant work when he is a linguist. He still teaches over at MIT, but he's written numerous articles on how even babies, they will actually bring a the reason why they can understand so much language in the very beginning of their lives, the first 2 years, is because there's likely categories in their own brain that put subject, verbs, and objects in their proper place. So my little boy, for example, is 3, and I remember when when I'm sitting there talking to him when he was about 1.5 or 2, he was already starting to put a subject himself, or I want verb the milk, which is an object. So I didn't actually talk to him about any kind of grammatical rules. I wasn't like, hey, Eli, this is a subject, yourself, verb, want, or I would like milk versus the object. That's actually my child knocking on the door. Sorry. Sweetie, please don't do that. I'm lecturing, okay? Lizzie, I'm lecturing, honey. Lizzie, I love you. I can't talk right now. Okay, if your nose hurts, please go ask Mama, okay, honey? I have to lecture, sweetheart. Thank you. A little comic relief there. I'm sure I was going to edit this out, but no, I won't. This is the beauty of lecturing at home. That's my 5-year-old. So what grammatical truths are? So grammatical truths. I didn't actually sit down with my little boy and say, okay, these are grammatical rules. Okay, I didn't do that. And so that kind of proves that there is such a thing as necessary truth. Okay. I'm still kind of laughing about that. So that's what necessary truth is. So necessary truth is what you bring to the table innately. Nobody actually taught it to you, versus empirical truth, which is based on our own experience. And you could see some of the how this is contrasted, especially in the relationship with what we know about God. What you bring to the table in a necessary way, I guess your presuppositions, is going to dictate on what you say about God or what you don't say about God. Okay, so God is a very, very important element in philosophy, because that is actually both, for people, it's a necessary and it's an empirical truth. Okay, so if people believe that God exists, that's going to be really kind of both. There are theologians that would say that that's something that's innate. And that's really where the ontological argument comes from. Ontological argument is basically, it's the innate argument. And that's really what Anselm was trying to get at. I didn't explain that last week, and I'd like to explain it this week, is that Anselm was basically saying you cannot deny the existence of God. It's almost impossible. Once you try, you keep basically talking about him, and you can't imagine perfection without God, therefore God exists. I know it seems really confusing, but basically what he was saying was that God is a necessary truth for all of reality. You can't talk about morals, you can't talk about afterlife, you can't talk about ethics without the necessary truth of God. And then the empirical reality of that's where people would kind of put it on faith. The empirical point would be, look at how God has answered my prayer. God has caused some healing in my own life through a degenerative disease. God has given me peace and comfort. But that, from an atheist perspective, you could see it's very, very different. And you could see the contrast in page 146. You have the theist proof versus the atheist proof. And where they disagree is the necessary and empirical truths, but it really comes to the existence or the non-existence of God. If you don't believe in God, your whole construction of reality, your whole construction on what is necessarily true versus empirically true are going to be very, very different. That doesn't mean that, and so that's why a lot of people have often tried to strive for some kind of natural law, even if somebody doesn't necessarily believe in God, that at least there's some natural law out there, objective reality out there, that whether you're a theist or agnostic or an atheist, we all can kind of appeal to. All right, so God would be a really good example of where you're bringing necessary and empirical truth as combined. All right, so I want to move on. That kind of sets, that hopefully kind of sets the stone, or sets the not stone, but sets the stage for the differences between rationalism versus empiricism. So a very unlikely thing occurred in philosophy, in the sense that you have people who strongly advocate for necessary truths and then people who strongly advocate for empirical truth. Maybe I'm speaking ahead right here, but I almost wish philosophers would just kind of like stop polarizing one another so much, because unfortunately in philosophy you get somebody that's saying there's only necessary truth, and that's like Descartes and Kant and Hegel. And then you have people that basically say, no, there's only empirical truth. There's only truth that's based on our feelings and our subjective experience. And that's where you get Locke, and that's where you get Berkeley, and that's where you get Hume and John Stuart Mill. And as an outsider looking in, I almost want to say to you, to both sides, I'm like, it's really, does it have to be either or? Why can't they both be somewhat true? And that's kind of where Immanuel Kant was going. And I'm kind of speaking ahead here, because Immanuel Kant kind of takes that where it's somewhat necessarily true. Even though Immanuel Kant is seen as a pure rationalist, I do think he takes some truths of empiricism and tries to construct some form of reality. So there are people that would say you can't know all truth, that truth doesn't make sense unless it's necessarily true, that there's something innately inside of us. And there are people who say, no, it's based on experience. You see the same kind of debate going about grammar, in linguistics. So Noam Chomsky is often debating with the Safar-Whorf school that says that grammar is actually taught. This is all basically a social construct. And Noam Chomsky is often saying, no, it's not it's not a social construct. It's you can't. The fact that babies learn something like 20,000 words and usages and everything else within 3 years, you can't say that it's just a pure social construct. And then Safar-Whorf school, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, would say, no, it's only based on experience. And then they just kind of bicker at one another. And I'm like, well, could it be a little bit of both? Because yes, it's innately true, but at the same time, grammar is something that you're constantly learning throughout your whole life. All right, and you never actually feel like you get to the point where you've learned everything about grammar. So you get what I'm kind of saying with that. So that's really the two differences here. So the empiricists are going to say tabula rasa, which just means blank slate, and everything you come in contact with is your experience, whereas rationalism is going to be based on reason, the innate reason inside of you. Isn't this fun? Don't you guys love philosophy? This is so fun. Okay, so then that kind of that then sets the stone on your presuppositions. And so presuppositions is basically what you presuppose before in our thinking. The presuppositions are of our thinking, without which we could believe nothing, know nothing, or think nothing else. In other words, think of a presupposition as kind of like the cause. The cause of something and the effect. All right, the cause and the effect of what I bring to the table causes per se, or is contingent on what then affects me. I don't really like that language as much, because the article, I'm not the article, but the chapter then kind of has some problems with contingency and stuff like that. But just kind of work with me for a moment. Your presuppositions are really basically what you assume prior to coming, what you assume prior to the argument. Okay, so if you assume the existence of God, you're going to see how nature or reality is defined a particular way than if you don't assume the existence of God. And that's what I was kind of talking about before in the whole lecture. And then skepticism kind of comes into this and says, well, a pox on all your houses. It is just basically assumptions, and so how can you actually argue for objective truth or some kind of truth out there when you can't actually, when you really, it doesn't seem like you could truly know anything. And that's where skepticism kind of, comes into the picture. And philosophy is constantly fighting back and forth with this with this debate, when someone would say something very objectively sound that is, and then somebody would say, well, you really can't know this. There are times where I could give you a counter argument where that assumption about reality or presupposition reality just doesn't actually hold sway. And so therefore skepticism actually comes in. And so so a good example of that is what David Hume did. David Hume was a skeptic, and there was this assumption basically that God existed because the laws of cause and effect. And so before David Hume, there were a lot of theologians that said that most of the philosophers were hardcore theists, at least theists, much more hardcore than compared to today. And so many theists just assume that you can't explain reality without causality. You you can't explain any kind of reality without causality, and therefore, if causality is an assumed law of philosophy, which it is, false cause fallacy, stuff like that, there has to be some kind of giver. There has to be some lawmaker. And so there has to be someone in the very, very beginning to have caused all the whole world to have existed. And David Hume actually he really challenged that, because Hume actually said, well, there are actually counterexamples to where everything isn't basically is not based on cause and effect. And so when you read David Hume, he would say that there are times that there's no such thing as actual cause, that cause is kind of a made up word. And Hume would say what you only see is how they relate to one another. And so he gives kind of an example of a billard, for example, when you're at a pool table and you hit the ball, and the ball then kind of hits the other ball and it goes into the hole. Many people, when they're looking at it, they'll just say, oh, look, that white ball caused the black ball to actually go inside the hole. And what David Hume said was like, no, not necessarily, because do you ever actually see the cause? Okay, and he would say, no, what you only see is the relationship of two independent forms. Okay, and that's it. You have to kind of wrap your head around that for a little bit. But he actually kind of has a point. You don't ever actually see cause. It's an assumption of cause. You're assuming that the black hole is going to go into the corner because the white hole hits it from this angle. But that's an assumption. What you really only see is just the relationship of how these two go together. And so David Hume also gave it a little bit a better example when you say, for example, when you see water on the ground, and I think I remember saying this in the beginning of the lecture, that must mean it rained last night. It's like, no, there could have been dew. There could have been somebody's sprinkler was on. You never actually see the cause of the wetness. What you see is the relationship between the water and the ground. But that relationship sometimes is maybe it's 99.9% always the case, but you can't actually always assume that there must be, therefore, a causal maker. And that's where David Hume was coming into the picture. And so he was really saying that you can't necessarily just assume all of these laws of causality, which is our innate experience, because many times the experience actually goes against you. All right, so I hope I kind of explained David Hume right there. And skepticism also was also outlined. I'm kind of going a little backwards here. Forgive me for that. By Descartes. And so let me kind of back up for a moment. So that's David Hume, and David Hume brought skepticism from the empirical standpoint. That what I meant by that is that David Hume therefore would say you can't necessarily assume anything necessarily or from an innate or an a priori experience. It is purely based on empiricism. Okay, and that example of that would be the cause and effect. Because cause and effect is something that we innately, supposedly bring to the table. David Hume would say, no, there are experiences that go against that innateness. Therefore, innateness doesn't exist. It's only empirical. Okay, that's David Hume's skepticism, i.e., this is why I believe in only empiricism being the necessary form of truth. Okay, that's David Hume. Descartes would completely contradict David Hume, or he went against David Hume. And I should have said Descartes first, but I was kind of on a David Hume rant for a minute. So Descartes, who came before David Hume, Descartes would say, no, experience is something that is, we can't necessarily rely on. So Descartes would say, I'm doubting everything. I'm doubting that I even exist. I doubt that there are books behind me. I doubt that this coffee mug is even, that I'm even holding it. I'm doubting that I even have an iPhone 7. So he doubted and doubted and doubted and doubted until he basically got to the point where he couldn't doubt anymore. And the only time that he reached that conclusion was the statement, cogito ergo sum. I think. He can't doubt that he's thinking. So I can't doubt that I'm thinking about these things. So that's the one thing that I cannot doubt. I'm doubting. I can't doubt the fact that I'm doubting. Okay, that's where Descartes would go from. That's where he would. And he finally reached. He finally felt like he reached where there was true objective truth. I can't rely on empiricism. I can't rely on what's out here. I can't doubt that I'm actually thinking, and therefore, I think I therefore exist. Okay, that's Descartes. Really kind of brilliant when you think about it. And so after Descartes, then Hume came and said, no, you can actually doubt your innateness and stuff like that. So you get kind of where the struggle and where both of these philosophers are coming at. And again, I'm thinking to the back. I'm like, oh, I'm in the background. I was like, why can't they just both be true? And that's actually where then, lo and behold, Immanuel Kant comes in. And Immanuel Kant kind of goes in because he's reading David Hume. He's reading him, and Kant is just all of a sudden he puts it in these words: "I'm awoken from my slumber." And what he meant by that was he was very kind of, in one way, he was kind of bored with philosophy, even though he was studying it. But also, he just had these assumptions, much like Descartes, on innate knowledge and all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden, David Hume, and he's awoken from my slumber. A lot of people kind of struggle on what Kant actually meant when he said that. When he read Hume, was it like a conversion experience to philosophy, or was it like, finally he was woken up that he felt like he had to answer Hume's assumptions that we have to kind of doubt everything innately, and therefore it's just outside reality. And I think it's a little bit of both. And so Kant kind of came in and he said, well, actually, and this is where even though people call him a rationalist, I think he's kind of using a little bit of both. I mean, Kant is one of the most difficult freaking philosophers that you'll ever read in your whole entire life. But what Kant actually said was, what people have is a priori categories, okay? And so they have these categories inside their brain, and but at the same time, they need to experience the world. And so he expands on that whole two-world assumption. So it's the inner world and the outer world. And the inner world put things in categories. So, for example, this is a cup, but it's not just a cup, it's a coffee cup with a blue and brown exterior. Okay. This is deodorant. Okay. It's not just, it's a type of deodorant. It's not Old Spice, even though I like Old Spice much more. It actually makes me smell more manly. Speed Stick makes me smell like a teenage football player. I don't know, but it works. That's why I get it. But it's not Old Spice. It's a type of deodorant, and it's not only it's an antiperspirant. Perspirant deodorant. I think. Anyway, and you get what I'm saying. I'm going to keep. So what did I just do? What did I just do? I'm sitting there like explaining all these things to you. Well, I'm actually at first I had to put my brain immediately had to put things into a category. I didn't call this a lamp. Okay. I didn't call this a turtle. Okay. I immediately have a category for them. So it's a priori. And Kant notices this. And then he says, but I still have to engage the world. I have to kind of tell you, the audience, outside of myself what this is. And so I put these categories on these very things. You see how he's kind of doing a little bit of both? There's the assumption, the a priori, and then there's the naming of that very object. So it's true based on experience to a sense, but it's also true because of my amazing innate abilities. So he's kind of bringing them together in a way. All right. So that's where Immanuel Kant comes in. And then, I think Solomon Higgins, they do a great job on explaining when it comes to science, because science, or good science, is really concerned about on these assumptions as well. Basically, what Solomon Higgins are doing, is showing that it is a little bit of true. I mean, they're both somewhat true, the experience and also the innate categories that we put on these things. And so that's where science actually does come in, because when you look at a hypothesis, when it comes to a hypothetical question, what you're doing is you're telling what facts you're looking for, okay? And then a theory is telling you how you understand those facts, all right? How do you categorize them, all right? So that, so when you're studying chemistry, for example, it's not just putting all of the different, basically every single chemical substance in the world, and just you're not just looking at the table and saying, okay, oxygen and hydrogen, and just defining the terms. You're not doing that, because does that really mean that you actually understand chemistry? When you look at biology, for example, it's not like you're just saying, okay, this is a bear, this is not a bear, this is a turtle, this is not a turtle. Is that all you're doing? Does that actually mean that you understand biology? Okay. That's why I said in your journal, please don't just define, David Hume said this, and this, and then, Kant said this, and this, because you're not actually telling me that that you've learned anything, right? So that's not science. Science is actually integrating what you know into a form of reality. Okay, and that's really what evolution is. Evolution is saying, okay, it looks like there's a survival of the fittest. It looks like certain genes actually work, have helped certain categories of species to evolve a little bit and adapt in particular environments. And so then you apply that to the actual theory of evolution, which then says, some of the assumptions that we have in evolution, whether it's the survival of the fittest or adaptation or genetic predispositions and all these other things. So anyway, that's kind of like a good example of that. So science tries to do a little bit of both right there. So I want to take a breath. Whew. Oh, I love. And now I want to end on, I think what basically, I really want to just kind of focus on this chapter. I think when it comes to self, hope you guys are okay. I think I'm just going to kind of, anyway, just quickly go over self in a minute. But I want to end on this, quickly go over self in the sense that I just want to talk a little bit about what the chapter talks about. But again, I'm not going to lecture on it, if maybe only for a few minutes. So anyway, so chapter 5, the search for truth, then talks about what do we do with facts. So let me just kind of summarize a little bit. So we talked about the difference between rationalism versus empiricism. Rationalism is the innate. Empiricism is basically what we experience. Then we talked about how Hume and Kant and how they kind of struggled with this. And then we talked about how science has a relationship with these things. And now I want to talk about the differences between the coherent theory of truth, the contingent theory of truth versus the coherent nature of truth. And I think this is very good. This is a good place to end, because this is kind of how we bring everything together. The correspondence theory, not the contingent, but the correspondence theory, basically just says that you can't know anything without facts. Okay, and that's all right. So unless you actually have facts, you actually can't know anything. So what the correspondence theory of truth is saying is that its true beliefs or sentences only correspond to facts. So it's a very, very objective view. So unless you can actually prove facts out there, you can't actually say anything that's necessarily true. Now, hopefully by now, after listening to 30 minutes of all these differences between empiricism and rationalism, you probably already kind of see you might even see some problems with this immediately. Well, what are some of the problems? Well, if there's no such thing as truth outside of the facts, how do you actually gather the information? That's the first thing. How do you actually bring these facts in and categorize them? That's the second question. And also, if it's just outside of us and we're here, how does the point of contact ever occur? So there are people out there that will be very, very uncomfortable, and there's philosophers out there too, who are very uncomfortable with anything that doesn't look like a perfect, consistent form of factual information. All right, and this is exactly what Nietzsche he was very frustrated with. All right, because that does not necessarily speak for that is not necessarily. There are so many evidences where that's just not factually true. A good example of that would be detective stories, for example. So when you're actually, say for example, that you have a case where you basically know this person has committed a significant crime, the correspondent theory of truth would never apply in those situations, because you would have to always, in every circumstance, 100% prove that something outside or factually has to coincide with that particular case, which you can't do. You can't do in the court of law. The court of law actually is much more of an inductive form of logic. And what I mean by that, it looks more at the coherent theory of truth. All right, that the likelihood of this person committing this particular crime is so much higher, and that is why we can actually say that this person is either guilty or not guilty. All right. So the correspondence theorists would say, well, what about people that went to jail and when they were innocent, and therefore we should just completely change the whole system until we find a perfect system. And the problem with that, again, is that you can't actually find a perfect system. We have to try to, because facts that are outside of us per se, um, uh, the likelihood of you actually being able to find that is very, very small. In fact, it doesn't truly exist, because once you kind of come in contact with them, they no longer are purely objective. I hope that kind of makes sense. So basically, don't worry about the correspondence theory of truth, because I think that's actually the chapter. Well, I mean, worry about it, but the chapter actually does a good job showing why that's very unfounded and it's unsound. That's different from the coherent or the coherence theory of truth. That true beliefs, including beliefs about experience and sentences, cohere with one another. So the book gives a really good illustration on 171, where it says, when you talk about maybe an animal like a cat, there are a multiplicity of statements they could talk about a cat that's maybe sitting on a mat. Okay, you don't just say the cat is on the mat and that's the only thing that's true. That's the correspondence theory. You say the cat is a tabby. It has a tabby type of color. The cat is actually in a great. The cat is actually in the. It's in the corner. The cat is on the mat. Yes, that's true. The cat is actually purring, or the cat actually looks like it's going to claw me. The cat is not on the porch. The cat is pregnant. Okay, I could just keep saying all of these things, and there's not just one statement outside of that experience. It's a variety of statements that are actually all corresponding with one another. Okay, that's the correspondence nature of reality. That's different. The coherent theory of reality. That's different from the correspondence nature of reality. So basically, what the coherent theory of reality states is you have to bring all these different categories together to make true statements. Okay, not just one or two. Okay, but many. All right. And then finally, there's the pragmatic theory that what is true is something that practically works. In other words, it actually applies in different situations. So the pragmatic theory I think kind of completes what the coherence theory is actually saying, that you have to bring multiple categories into the equation. And the pragmatic theory is then saying, this is how it applies. This is actually how it works. So the cat is something that's comforting to me when I pet it. The cat kills lots of mice. Say for example, if I used to live in a horse farm, so we used to have lots of cats because they would just kill all the mice in the barns because the mice would actually scare the horses away. So that's why we had lots of cats. So it's very practical to have a cat, and that's just as true. So what those theories are trying to complete and what these theories are trying to mature is the whole correspondence theory that just says, there's all reality is just factual, just facts outside of here. And the coherent and practical says, well, that's a little incomplete because there are many situations where it's not just something that's out there. You have to there's a multiplicity of true statements as well as the pragmatic element of that as well. In the chapter, I'm not going to talk on this. The chapter then talks about some problems with subjectivism. So, real quick, I just want to, I want to talk about self. Again, I'm just going to keep this pretty short, just maybe a minute or two. Only because there's, what you need to kind of understand is that self. How the chapter really kind of focuses on the concepts of self. What is self? Is there such a thing as an essential self? Okay, so an essential self would be is there such a thing that you can define as a core of people? And then also, how do you bring different parts of these people together? So are people made up of lots of parts, for example? Are people made up of parts of them that may be, quote, like more managerial? And then do they have parts of them also that tend to want to just escape reality? And then do they also have parts of them that want to just kind of feel a lot of shame? All right. So that kind of brings the table that how do you explain multiplicity of people? How do you explain people who, when they have a part of them, for example, that always wants to work, and then at the end of their day, they have another part that says, "Oh gosh, I got to go to the bar," and then this part of them that says they get really drunk, and then why are they getting drunk? Because they're working all the time, and then maybe they pick up somebody that they're not supposed to, sleep with somebody they're not supposed to, and the next morning they just feel all this guilt. Okay, what is that? What is all that all about? This part that feels all its guilt certainly wasn't the part of them that decided to work, and it's definitely not the part of them that decides to go to the bar and just get wasted and be pretty irresponsible. So what is that? It seems like people are made up of a multiplicity of different sides of them. And that then therefore brings up the equation, the question, is there such a thing as kind of like a core? Is there something like a self, like a core self inside of me or inside of you that tries to balance all these things together? Okay, that's kind of it's basically the chapter is an existential question. What do you think? I'd love to get your all's thoughts on that. There's, how do you even define self? It seems like it's very difficult to define in one term. That self can be defined in multiple. You can use multiple adjectives when you're describing self, such as the thinking self, or the self that remembers, the self that desires, the self that just kind of whatever, whims away certain things, the self that wants to have will and choice, the self that is passionate about art, and then also the self that is rational. So what do you do with all that? Does that mean there's multiple realities, or does it mean, as what I was saying before, the coherent theory of knowledge, or the coherent understanding of truth, that we have to bring all these different realities into a complete whole? All right, so it's a fun chapter to read, just on what do we do with our emotions, or how do we define the egotistic predicament, because that brings in a good question, that if it's true that I have these multiple forms to me, and I can't actually come in contact with you in a reciprocal way unless I am somehow inside the relationship. That brings up the whole question of freedom. Okay, am I ever really truly free? Which is the next chapter that we're about to read. If my wills and my desires and my passions all kind of define me per se, is there such a thing that's kind of outside of myself that we could say that there's a quote free will? So how does freedom is actually defined? And then self is actually, this is important, where this is an important chapter, is also setting up the question on ethics, okay, which we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. And then finally, I guess a little bit longer than just 2 minutes, it's actually kind of, not more talking about it, it brings up the whole question of the mind and the body. Is mind something that's outside of us? Is there something that's, that soul or self are equated as one thing? Is mind and body together, right? Is it just my neurons, or are they somewhat separate? That kind of dualistic understanding of the world. Okay, so I'll let you guys just kind of play with that chapter a little bit, but I definitely wanted to tell you about chapter 5. Again, keep working on your journals. There's no reason why you should not be able to give me more than 2 pages. Okay, if you're not able to give me 2 pages, at this point I'm just gonna be like, okay, yeah, I'm counting out like 15 points, because there's tons of information in here. It's kind of like going to the Grand Canyon and saying, I'm sorry, I can only take like 2 pictures. I'm like, well, maybe not quite the same illustration, but pretty close to it. It's like, yeah, you could take more than 2 pictures. You could take like 80. So again, there's and then when you're writing your journals, remember, it's not just a biography in the very beginning. I kind of actually when somebody kind of starts the beginning of the journal, this is the story of my life. My brain actually just turns off. I'll be honest with you, and the reason for that is because, again, I'm not trying to be mean. It's just like you haven't earned my respect yet. If I could be really blunt with you, you in philosophy, you can't earn the respect of other philosophers unless you actually tell me what the argument is. Once you tell me what the argument is, once you tell me what David Hume is saying, once you tell me what Kant is basically saying, you define the terms, bam. Okay, what does Bill say? I want to see what he says. What does Karen say? That's when you've earned the respect. But once you start the journal with just basically, I believe that the meaning of life is da-da-da-da, and let me tell you my own personal story, I just turn off. Okay, just turn off. So just, again, it's a different type of thinking. I know you might have to swallow some pride. That's okay. This is philosophy. This is why we do it. All right. All right, guys. I'm going to extend the assignments because I was trying to get this to Tuesday afternoon, because I know I've waited a while for the lecture. So I'm a very, very busy man. I was trying to get the lecture in by Wednesday. This is going to be hard. So I don't think my little girl has knocked on the door, but she is calling for me. All right. Bye, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. See ya.